Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this term's Leading Voices in Higher Education lecture. This series is part of Dartmouth's efforts to make our community not only more diverse, but also more inclusive. And of course, both of these factors are absolutely essential to the institutional change that we want to see and to the success and thriving of all members of our community, which is critical, of course, to fulfilling our mission. This lecture series brings experts on important issues in higher education to help inform us and also to help us have a conversation here at Dartmouth about important issues in higher education, and to create an environment where we discuss these issues openly in order to move us, I think, to a place where we'd all like to see the institution and our community go. So before I introduce our speaker, though, I want to thank a few people for helping to make this event possible. Naraya Brodus, Director of Strategic Initiatives in the Provost Office, and also Tom Dexter Rice, the Presidential Fellow in the Provost Office, and Patty Moffett in the Provost Office. Thank you very much for helping make today possible. And now turning to our speaker and our event today. I think, as we all know, in part from our excellent colleagues and scholars in the geography department and other social sciences, most of us grow up in homogeneous neighborhoods and schools. University campuses are a place that are much more diverse often than the communities where we come from. And just like our workplaces, our social worlds, et cetera, are becoming more and more diverse within and across the U.S., we need to think about how we come together across our differences to produce communities that are not only diverse, but inclusive in the most fundamental sense of what that means, participatory inclusiveness for the success of all. We at Dartmouth, like I think many places in the United States, are having challenges in really living up to those goals. And so thinking about our increasingly diverse world, not only in the United States, with increasing racial and ethnic diversity across the country, but thinking globally at our interconnected world, we have to do better at coming together across difference, not only for the success of all the members of our community, but in order to deal with the significant challenges that our local communities and our global world face. And so that's what we're doing here today and in this series, to discuss these issues and bring in leading scholars to help us think about these issues today. They will help us develop the positive intergroup relations that we need to address challenges and also to fully benefit from the value that diversity and full participatory inclusion can create in our world. So I'm really glad to see so many people here today to engage in this conversation. There are few people better suited to help us have this conversation about positive intergroup relations today than our guest, Linda Tropp. A professor of social psychology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Professor Tropp is an expert on intergroup relations, studying how members of different groups experience contact with each other and how differences in power and status affect views of and expectations for cross-group relationships. She's written extensively on this topic, having published a number of books and edited volumes, as well as scores of articles in top social psychology journals. Professor Tropp has received the Alport Intergroup Relations Prize from the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues for her work and research on intergroup contact. She's received the Erik Erikson Early Career Award for distinguished research contributions from the International Society of Political Psychology and the McKeechee Early Career Teaching Award from the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. Her work is dedicated to bringing the power of research to bear against prejudice, and she has worked with state and national initiatives to improve intergroup understanding, especially in the education and criminal justice systems, And she has also worked with non-governmental and international organizations to reduce racial and ethnic conflict. She has also worked with the American Psychological Association to submit briefs to the highest courts in several cases relating to school integration. Her record as a voice for the elimination of prejudice and for the development of positive cross-group relations is truly impressive, and we're delighted to welcome her to Dartmouth. So please join me in welcoming Professor Linda Tropp.
Thank you, Denise, for that lovely and somewhat embarrassing introduction. And I really appreciate all that you and others in the Provost Office did to organize this event. Just to introduce myself, I'm trained as a social psychologist, and most of my research, as Denise pointed out, concerns strategies to try to reduce racial bias and prejudice and to understand better how members of different racial and ethnic groups in particular relate and interact with each other. But just rather than just talk about my research today, I actually want to give you a little bit of an overview of some social science perspectives on racial bias and intergroup relations so that you can learn a little bit more about the broader types of work that we do. So just to start off, in light of the events of the past year, it seems pretty clear that we do not live in a post-racial society, even though that might have been claimed when Obama was first elected. But rather, there are still numerous ways in which race and racial biases continue to have a major impact on our lives and in our communities. And while we could all probably agree that race is playing an important role, we might not necessarily all see race or racial bias in the same way. So just to give you some examples from recent polls, you can see in a 2013 Pew Research poll that Black respondents are much more likely than white respondents to say that Black Americans are treated less fairly than whites in their communities. And this is across many different domains in life, whether we're talking about in their dealings with police, in the courts, at work, in public schools, and so on. Another Pew poll is also showing that Black respondents are much more likely than white respondents to say that police shootings of Black men raise important issues around race for our society. And here I think it's also really important for us to note that we don't simply differ in our perceptions of racial biases and racial issues, but social science research shows that there are also many differences in what we're actually like to experience as members of different racial groups. So here's an example of what's often referred to as an audit study, where the researchers sent virtually identical resumes to potential employers that were ostensibly from white, Latino, and Black applicants. And these resumes were purposely matched on things like prior experience and educational backgrounds, that the only real difference between these applicants was their race or ethnicity. And this study, like several other studies, shows that even with comparable or equal qualifications, Black and Latino applicants are significantly less likely to get callbacks or job offers relative to these comparable white applicants. And we see these types of trends not only in the case of employment, but sadly also in the context of higher education. So for example, in this study, the researchers sent emails to professors that were ostensibly from advanced students who were interested in learning more about the professor's work and potentially working with them in their labs. Here, what they did was they simply varied the names of the students so that it appeared that either a white or a non-white student or a male or a female student was contacting the professor. And what they did as researchers was compared how often the emails that were ostensibly from white male students received responses compared to the emails that were ostensibly sent from female and non-white students. And they looked at this across a range of academic fields, and you can see in those red bars depicted in each domain that this represents how much more often white male students received responses from professors as compared to the responses received from female or non-white students. So through these examples, we can see how even though we might wish for racial bias and discrimination to be things of the past, race still matters, and it can have really profound effects. Now, of course, there are many different forms of bias and discrimination that we can consider in relation to many different types of groups beyond race. So we need to ask ourselves more broadly, well, why is it that these forms of bias and discrimination exist? What happens when we think about ourselves and others as members of different groups? And what the research literature would suggest is that we have a fairly natural tendency to favor members of our own groups over members of other groups. That is, when we think about ourselves and others as members of different groups or in terms of our group memberships, we have this natural tendency and motivation to like us, who we are, more than we are motivated to like them or who they are. Now, it's not necessarily that we're motivated to put other groups down. It's not that that's our motivation. We're really just motivated to boost ourselves up and feel good about who we are. But this bias in favor of our own groups, who we are, can often present itself in a variety of ways. So for example, researchers have distinguished between what's called explicit bias, where people are more consciously aware of their biases and able to articulate openly how they feel towards different groups, such as, I like group X, or I'm not so crazy about group X. And that would be in contrast to implicit bias, where people may be less aware of their biases and less able to consciously access or control their responses in relation to members of other groups. And these are usually assessed using what are called implicit measures. So implicit measures are used to assess people's less accessible or less controllable responses to members of other groups. And I'm going to walk us through what is a commonly used measure known as the implicit associations test. And as you can see in the example on the right-hand side, this test basically is asking people to make associations between two target categories, such as whites and blacks, and some sort of evaluative dimension, such as good or bad. And this test basically examines whether we're just as likely to regard these two groups or these two categories as good, or whether it's easier or more natural for us to regard one of these groups as good compared to the other, which would be an indicator of bias. Now, if you visit the Project Implicit website at Harvard University, you'll see many different versions of this test, examining bias in relation to many different types of groups. Now, first, I also want to ask, how many people here have completed a version of the implicit association test? Oh, about half of you. So today, just for the purposes of example, and especially for those of you who have never completed this type of test before, I'm going to walk us through a simple version of the implicit associations test that will ask us to make associations between the categories of insects and flowers and in relation to the evaluative dimension of pleasant versus unpleasant. So what you can see up here in this test is that there's going to be a series of items that will appear on future slides with words that represent insects, flowers, or pleasant or unpleasant words. So you can see some examples of the insect items there: wasp, flea, roach, and gnat. And you can see some examples of the flowers items, things like orchid, tulip, rose, and daisy. You can also see examples of pleasant words like gentle, love, heaven, and cheer. And you can see examples of unpleasant words such as poison, evil, vomit, and gloom. Pretty gloomy, I know. So what you're going to see on the next slide is you're going to see 3 columns of these words in random order. In fact, it's going to look an awful lot like that. What I'm going to want you to do is I'm going to want you to start with the left-hand column at the top and go all the way through the bottom, then go to the middle column, start at the top and go all the way through the bottom, and then go to the right column, all the way from the top to the bottom. And as you read each of these words, each of these items in those columns, I want you to respond as quickly as possible without thinking too much about it in one of 2 ways. So what I'm going to want you to do is to tap your left knee, okay? Tap your left knee. Thank you for practicing already. I want you to tap your left knee with your left hand if the word represents flowers or something pleasant, and I'm going to want you to tap your right knee if the word represents insects or something unpleasant. And as I say this, I want to remind you that I want to be able to hear these taps. So I don't want these little lily-livered taps. Let's give me some taps. Excellent, excellent. So again, just thinking about the associations that I'm asking you to make, tap with your left knee, or tap your left knee if it's flower or pleasant, and your right knee if it's insect or unpleasant. And you can start as soon as I put the next slide up. Okay, so how did that go? I don't know about your perspective. Yeah, I got some thumbs up. From here, it sounded like a nice little marching band. I think you guys did great. So what I want us to do, though, is the exact same task again, but now repeating that task with different associations. Okay, so this time, I'm going to ask you to tap your left knee with your left hand if the word represents insects or pleasant, and to tap your right knee with your right hand if the word represents flowers or unpleasant. So again, retraining ourselves, we'll tap the left if it's insects or pleasant, and we'll tap the right if it's flowers or unpleasant. And you're going to see the exact same list of words. And again, I want you to start off at the top of the left column, go down the way through, then to the middle column, go all the way through, then to the right column, and all the way through. Again, tapping on the left if it's insects or pleasant, and tapping on the right if it's flowers or unpleasant. Everybody ready? Excellent. All right, and you can start as soon as it comes up. Should I put you out of your misery? I think the time has come. So yeah, from here, I heard a little bit of laughter in the room. You might have noticed that it took some of us a bit more time to do that second trial, to make associations between insect and pleasant compared to the relative ease with which we made associations between flowers and pleasant. And this suggests that it's much more just common or natural for us to think about flowers as pleasant than it is for us to think about insects as pleasant, right? And this is exactly what the implicit associations test is all about, the relative ease or difficulty with which we're inclined to think about different categories in terms of being positive or negative, or in terms of being pleasant or unpleasant. Now, we can see the effects emerging with simple categories such as flowers and insects. Let's take a moment to think about if we were to do the same type of test in the context of race relations or making associations between whites and blacks with good and bad. And there's more than a decade of research with tests like these, but in the context of race, showing that white people who are more biased on this type of test, showing a more pro-white bias, are faster to see anger in black faces as compared to in white faces. So when they're presented with a series of images going from a happy face to an angry face, that they are faster to see anger in the black face before they would see anger for a comparable facial expression in a white face. That they're less likely to smile or engage in friendly behavior with black partners as compared to with white partners. Again, whites who score highly in bias on this type of test are more likely to associate black faces with criminality than they are with white faces, being faster to detect weapons in fuzzy images as compared to when they're primed to think about whites. And they're also faster to shoot unarmed black targets than white targets in crime simulations, such as when the target is either holding a gun or a cell phone, where the cell phone would be the unarmed condition, making more errors in their judgment with a black target than with a white target. So we can see how even subtle biases of which we're not aware can often affect our perceptions and behaviors in relation to members of different groups. But at the same time, I think we also have to ask ourselves whether racial bias is really the only problem. And from a psychological perspective, I'd like you to just take a moment and think about and reflect on how it felt to complete those different versions of the flower insect IAT. Could you tell when you were making different associations? If you could tell that you had different associations across those trials, how did it feel? How did you feel about it? And how would you feel if you had found yourself making those same types of different patterns of associations for a white-black race-based IAT? And I want us to think about this because I can say for at least a lot of white people, what we're likely to feel about completing a white-black version of the IAT is probably something like this. That is, we might be aware of the fact that we're making some negative association along the way, but we don't necessarily feel good about it. And we might really, really want not to be biased, such that we become uncomfortable or anxious or concerned when we recognize that we actually do have some biases that we weren't aware of. So in addition to addressing racial bias, I think we also really need to address the role of racial anxiety. That is, the discomfort we feel when we engage with racial difference and with members of other racial groups. Because the anxiety we feel in relation to other groups can not only lead us to become more prone to relying on stereotypes. On some level, our brains freeze when we feel anxious, and it makes us more likely to rely on stereotypes or preconceived notions of what others are like, but can also lead us to engage in the same types of avoidant or distancing behaviors that correspond with racial bias. So what we might be experiencing as racial anxiety might be perceived by others with whom we're interacting as racial bias. So this begs the question, well, is there anything we can do to try to reduce racial bias and anxiety? Well, given that our biases function largely outside of our conscious awareness, it's really important to try to make ourselves more aware of the fact that we might be biased, and to lead ourselves to question and reflect on the types of associations we often make, even if we're not necessarily proud of them. And at the same time, we need to increase opportunities for contact between groups in order to alleviate racial anxiety, enhance our confidence and our experience and our willingness to engage across difference. And so here I'd like to talk a bit about the large body of research we have suggesting a number of positive effects that grow from having members of different groups interact with each other. The basic premise of research in this area is that having contact between members of different groups can be an effective tool for reducing intergroup prejudice. And here I just want to clarify that I'm referring to contact as actual face-to-face interaction between members of different groups. And I mention that because in some disciplines, percentages of immigrants or different racial and ethnic groups in a community are used as a proxy indicator of contact, where there might not be any actual face-to-face interaction between members of the different groups. So I just wish to clarify that when I'm using the term contact, I'm talking about instances of actual face-to-face interaction between members of different groups. And what we find is that generally contact between groups has been shown to be effective in reducing prejudice, and particularly when a few optimal conditions are met in the contact situation, so that the contact is infused or informed by those optimal conditions, including things like establishing equal status between the groups within the contact situation, that even if they have different groups outside of that situation, that they are treated and regarded as equals when they're brought together, that these groups are interacting with each other cooperatively and working toward common goals, and that they do so with institutional support, that is, with policies, laws, or customs from institutional authorities that explicitly endorse this type of equal status cooperative contact. Now, while these might seem like fairly basic principles, they've actually been pretty widely debated over the last several decades. For example, some have proposed that contact might do very little to change people's prejudices, or that contact between groups might actually breed or enhance prejudice. And so as a result, we haven't really had a good understanding of what the research literature was telling us overall. So additional work was needed to try to clarify, well, overall, what do we know about the effects of contact? Does contact actually reduce prejudice, or might it inadvertently increase prejudice? If it does reduce prejudice, to what extent is that effect consistent? Can we rely on that as a general trend? And we also want to learn more about the pathways or processes through which contact might be effective in reducing prejudice. So to accomplish those goals, I conducted a meta-analysis with Tom Pettigrew. And for those of you not familiar with this technique, meta-analysis is basically a quantitative integration of research studies, where you try to find every single study ever conducted on a particular topic, and you statistically pool the results to see overall what those data show. And so we conducted this type of analysis for the research literature on contact between groups. For our analysis, we found a total of 515 studies that were conducted between the 1940s and the year 2000, including data from approximately 250,000 participants in 38 different countries. So with this data set and pooling the data from all of these studies, we wanted to address that first general question: does contact tend to reduce prejudice? And the general answer to that general question appears to be yes, that overall greater levels of intergroup contact are typically associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. And this is summarized in the graph here, and so I want to give you a better sense of what you're looking at. So the first thing I want to point out is each of those little blue diamonds in the graph represents one of the studies in our meta-analysis. So there's at least 515 of those in that slide. If you look at the horizontal x-axis, where there's a 0 point in the middle where it says contact prejudice correlation, that basically means there's no meaningful relationship between contact and prejudice. But if you go from that 0 point to the negative end of the scale on the left, you can see that that's an association or a correlation such that greater contact is associated with less prejudice. It's a negative correlation because those variables are going in opposite directions. And you can see that the great bulk of the studies in our analysis, in fact 94% of them, are showing this relationship such that greater contact between groups is associated with lower levels of intergroup prejudice. The average for these cases is represented by the red line in the middle of the distribution, corresponding to a correlation coefficient of about negative 0.21. So for those of you familiar with statistics, it's a relatively modest correlation in terms of magnitude, but it's a highly significant effect given our sample size. But importantly, it's also a relatively consistent effect that just becomes a bit stronger or weaker depending on other characteristics of the studies. And I'll share some of those with you in a moment. But first, I want to just give you a sense of a sample graph that I'll be showing you to present more of the findings. And this basically meshes with the data that were represented in the previous slide, such that, again, the 0 point means there's no meaningful relationship between contact and prejudice. Higher scores would mean that contact's associated with more prejudice, and negative scores mean that contact is associated with lower prejudice. And that bar is representing that mean effect of negative 0.21. So one thing that we wanted to look at was whether contact might be similarly effective in reducing prejudice across different types of groups and contexts. So we looked at the age of the participants involved, and we find pretty consistently that contact is reducing prejudice for people from many different age groups, including children and adolescents, and among college students and adults. We also look at the types of target groups involved, and we find that greater contact is typically associated with less prejudice for many different types of groups, including people from different racial and ethnic groups, as well as people with different sexual identities, sexual orientations, and people with and without disabilities and mental illness. We also find that contact is associated with less prejudice across many different types of contact settings. That is, whether they come into contact in recreational settings, such as sports teams or boys and girls clubs, in organizational settings, such as workplaces, educational settings, such as public schools or universities, or residential settings, such as neighborhoods or housing apartment buildings. Altogether, we're finding pretty similar patterns of effect overall, such that greater contact is associated with less prejudice, giving us this sense of consistency in patterns of effect across many different types of groups, situations, and contexts. We also wanted to see whether the types of contact that people have matter for its potential to reduce prejudice. And we find that contact is especially likely to reduce prejudice when the contact takes the form of cross-group friendships, when you're developing close relations with members of other groups, and also when the contact situation is structured in line with those optimal conditions, embodying equal status cooperation and institutional support. We've also learned more about the processes through which contact reduces prejudice. And while it's long been thought that knowledge is a key pathway, such that greater contact leads us to gain more knowledge or learn more about other groups, which in turn reduces prejudice, we do see some evidence for that, but we see that even more important than knowledge are affective or emotional processes. That contact helps to reduce our anxieties in relation to other groups, while also enhancing our ability and willingness to empathize with other groups and their concerns, both of which contribute to reducing prejudice. Now, I just want to clarify that these different pathways for anxiety, knowledge, and empathy were all tested independently. I've just summarized them here for the sake of simplicity of presentation. Unfortunately, there's only a few studies in our field that look simultaneously at anxiety and empathy as possible pathways, but we've tested them against each other, and we actually find that they account for different pieces of the relationship between contact and prejudice. And this has actually led us to think about how maybe there's a sequential process going on, that maybe what we need to do is first reduce people's feelings of anxiety and threat about cross-group interactions so that they'll become more open to empathizing with members of other groups and their concerns. Now, in addition to these factors, there's many others that I could present, but I just want to present one methodological factor, which is the type of research study that was conducted to see whether experimental studies that actually test for the effects of contact on prejudice, testing that causal relationship of contact reducing prejudice, would show a significant effect. And in fact, that's exactly what we find. And in fact, if we look across many different methodological issues, what we tend to find is that the more rigorous the research procedures and the better designed the study was, the more clearly we see these relationships between contact and prejudice emerging, suggesting that the effect is really there. So in addition to just looking overall at the strength of experimental studies for testing cause and effect, I also want to walk you through one experimental study that we conducted showing how contact might also be helpful for reducing our anxieties and stresses about cross-group interactions. So in this study, we had white and Latino undergraduates who were coming to the lab, and they were randomly assigned to interact with either a same group or a cross-group partner. Before they met this partner, at a preliminary baseline session, we had them complete a variety of questionnaires. We had them complete a measure of implicit prejudice, similar to the one that you completed, but in relation to whites and Latinos. And we also asked them to provide saliva samples so that we could get baseline estimates of cortisol, a stress hormone, so we would have a hormonal indicator of stress. It's also quite humbling for people to spit into a cup in front of someone that they've never met. So then we randomly assigned them to either a same group or a cross-group partner. And over the course of 6 weeks, they returned to the lab to interact with this randomly assigned partner, either from their own ethnic group or the other ethnic group. They interacted for 3 contact meetings with this partner where they engaged in activities that were designed to encourage kind of friendly, cooperative behavior. After each of the meetings, we again asked participants to provide saliva samples to assess their cortisol levels as an indicator of how much stress they felt during the interaction with that partner that could be compared to their baseline cortisol levels. And after these 3 contact meetings, we also asked these participants to maintain a diary for 10 days, during which they reported any meaningful interactions that they had, who initiated the interaction, and also the race or ethnicity of the person with whom they interacted. So just to give you a couple of findings from the study, first, we found that our contact meeting procedures were successful, that overall these participants reported feeling closer and closer to their partner across the first, second, and third friendship meetings. And this was the case whether they were white or Latino themselves and whether they were assigned a same group or a cross-group partner. Everyone started to feel close to that partner they were paired with. We then find some interesting differences in cortisol reactivities or a stress response, but only among those participants who were paired with a cross-group partner. There were no significant differences among those paired with the same group partners. So what we see among those paired with a cross-group partner is that those who were initially high in implicit prejudice, those that are above that horizontal line, that at that first friendship meeting, they show a peak in cortisol reactivity compared to baseline. In summary, they were freaked out. They were kind of stressed out by this cross-group interaction. But importantly, what we also find is that that stress response attenuates over time, such that by the third friendship meeting, their stress response is comparable to those participants who were paired with a same group partner, as well as those who were low in prejudice paired with a cross-group partner. So together, these types of findings are suggesting that even people who are initially high in prejudice, who might be the most likely to feel uncomfortable about cross-group interactions, can come to feel less stressed about those interactions over time, given opportunities for those interactions. We also find that after these 3 contact meetings, those same participants who were initially high in prejudice were more likely to initiate further cross-group interactions if they had been paired with a cross-group partner than if they had been paired with a same-group partner. Again, suggesting that using experimental evidence that contact between groups can help to reduce people's feelings of stress in cross-group interactions, particularly among those who are higher in prejudice, and also can lead those same people to become more interested and open to engaging with members of other groups. Now, in addition to thinking about the possible effects of contact in reducing prejudice, there's also other research suggesting many positive outcomes of contact beyond prejudice reduction. I just want to highlight a couple here. For example, we've conducted a national phone survey of white South Africans where we assessed their contact experiences with Black South Africans in line with those optimal conditions for contact, that it's kind of friendly, close, equal status, and cooperative. And we were interested in predicting their policy attitudes, both in terms of compensatory policies, which would be training, education, and outreach programs to promote Black advancement, and also preferential policies where Blacks would potentially be selected over whites for positions in employment and in government as well. What we find is that among these white South Africans, greater contact with Black South Africans is predicting greater support for both types of policy outcomes, and this is the case even after we control for other common predictors of race-targeted policies, such as the extent to which those respondents are prejudiced against Blacks and the extent to which they feel threatened by Black advancement. We've also examined whether contact might help whites to become more likely to support and participate in collective action for racial justice. And through a couple of online surveys of white Americans, what we tend to find is that greater contact with Blacks is predicting greater empathy for what Blacks experience, which in turn predicts greater outrage regarding how Blacks are treated, which in turn predicts whites' greater participation in collective action for racial justice, both in general and also more specifically in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. So now, while these effects of contact are encouraging, we also need to keep in mind that the effects of contact might still differ importantly among members of different racial and ethnic groups. So for example, going back to our meta-analytic data, we find that on average, the positive effects and outcomes of contact tend to be weaker for members of racial minority groups than for members of racial majority groups, such as whites. And we've done additional research to try to replicate these results using data from a nationally representative sample of white and Black Americans, which included measures of intergroup contact, as well as a measure of intergroup closeness, or overall, how close do you feel to this other racial group, as well as the extent to which these respondents perceive discrimination against their own racial group. And what we find is that overall, intergroup contact, like in the meta-analysis, is predicting these attitudes of closeness more strongly among white respondents than among Black respondents. And at the same time, we see that perceived discrimination against one's own racial group is predicting significantly less closeness among Black respondents, while it's not having a significant effect among white respondents. So these pieces of data are important reminders that racial discrimination is playing an important role in inhibiting the potentially positive effects of contact, particularly from the perspective of Black Americans in these data. And this meshes with other research showing that members of ethnic minority and majority groups often have different motivations and concerns in intergroup contact, such that ethnic majorities are often concerned about being perceived as prejudiced and thereby seek to preserve their moral integrity, receive reassurance that they're not racist or prejudiced, whereas instead ethnic minorities are often concerned about becoming the targets of prejudice and discrimination, and thereby seek to be respected, empowered, and to be able to exercise their voice. Additionally, other research shows that members of ethnic minority and majority groups often have different beliefs and expectations surrounding their contact experiences, and I'd like to give you some brief examples of our work in this area. In one study, we conducted a study where we had ethnic minority and majority students provide open-ended responses to a question about diversity, as well as asking them to report their own interest in interracial contact. Specifically, we asked them to read and respond to the following question. In society today, people often talk about diversity and how important it is to include members of different groups. Even though claims are made that diversity is valued, people still vary in the degree to which they trust those claims to be true. What do you think? Do you believe people generally value diversity? And just to give you some examples of the responses that we received, you can see different undergraduate students saying things like, well, sometimes diversity is valued, but often people say more than they act upon, that they're kind of talking the talk, but not necessarily walking the walk. Others say that they believe that people value diversity in the abstract, but somewhat less so when they're actually faced with it. This idea like, well, of course I value diversity. Oh, but I need to do something about it now. I'm not so sure. Some people say, well, I think people of color value diversity more than the average white person because white people don't need to break out of their comfort zone. That maybe we value diversity to the extent that we're affected by concerns about diversity. And if we're not as affected by it, maybe we won't think about it or be as concerned about it. And then someone else says, well, people in general do value diversity, but people may say things to please other ethnic or racial groups, but in actuality, they may not honor those views. So on some level, we might value diversity and want to show that we value diversity, but in our own private lives, we might not follow up with actions that are correspondent with that. So we received a very wide range of responses, and what we sought to do was to just try to provide some simple categorizations for people's views regarding the extent to which they thought diversity was generally valued or not. So we had two independent coders come up with a rating system where they rated whether participants said, yes, diversity is clearly valued, no, diversity is clearly not valued, and then a yes, but, ... category where they said some caveats associated with the extent to which they felt diversity was valued. And what we did was we compared the responses of ethnic minority and majority students. And when we did so, we found that ethnic minority students were significantly less likely to say that diversity is valued and significantly more likely to say that diversity is not widely valued. Then when we examined these responses in relation to students' reported interest in intergroup contact, what we find is that those students who believe that diversity is not valued are significantly less likely to be interested in intergroup contact. And this effect was consistent for both ethnic, minority, and majority students. So together, these types of findings are suggesting that members of ethnic, minority, and majority groups might have distinct beliefs about the valuing diversity, which have downstream implications for how they feel about cross-group interactions. But we wanted to explore this further, to be more specific in this case about who values diversity, instead of asking generally about whether diversity is valued. So in a next study, we asked about the extent to which people report valuing diversity themselves and the extent to which they believe diversity is valued by other racial and ethnic groups. And in this case, ethnic minority students were asked about the extent to which they believe whites value diversity, and ethnic majority or white students were asked about the extent to which they believe students of color value diversity. And then we asked all students about the extent to which they believe that diversity is generally valued in our society. When we compare responses to the diversity measures, we find distinct patterns of results, again, for ethnic minority and majority students, such that while ethnic majority students report that they and others value diversity to a pretty similar extent, ethnic minority students report that they place a much greater value on diversity than do whites or the broader society. We then look to see how these perceptions of the extent to which diversity is valued would predict their interest in intergroup contact. And we find that valuing diversity for oneself, I think diversity is important to value, is what is uniquely predicting interest in contact among ethnic majority students. But that isn't predicting interest among ethnic minority students. It doesn't matter how much they personally value diversity. What matters for them is perceiving that whites value diversity. That is what's uniquely predicting their interest in intergroup contact. And we've found virtually identical results in a separate study of Black and white Americans. And together, what findings from these types of studies are suggesting is that divergent views regarding the extent to which racial and ethnic diversity is valued can have meaningful implications for people's willingness to seek out or engage in intergroup contact, to reach across group lines in those ways. And like the findings that I presented at the beginning of this talk, these findings, I believe, offer an important reminder that even though we live in a shared society, we often perceive and experience different social realities. Those have to be reckoned with. And I think it's important for us to remember this even as we recognize the positive changes that we have made around diversity and racial and ethnic relations in our society over time. Because in some respects, those of you in the audience who are students or those of you who are faculty and staff nurturing these future generations of citizens, we're all witnessing greater racial tolerance and support for diversity than perhaps we've ever seen in our society. We're witnessing that today. And this is exemplified in a 2014 poll of millennials that was conducted by Slate and MTV, who show that millennials on average show a deeper commitment to equality and fairness than any generation before them. But at the same time, this poll also shows that the majority of millennials believe that their generation is post-racial. And while the majority also believe that we should be more open in talking about racial bias, only 20% of those sampled indicated that they feel comfortable doing so. So we once again are seeing divergent views on the role of race between whites and racial minorities, even in this generation of millennials. Because 40% of the white millennials polled believe that too much attention is being paid by the government to racial minority concerns, and nearly 2/3 of millennials of color perceive that whites continue to have more opportunities than racial minorities. So pulling together some of the themes that we've been addressing today, I just want to highlight that racial biases and anxieties can affect our thoughts, our attitudes, and behaviors in relation to other groups, even if we're not fully aware of them or their impact. And greater contact between groups has the potential to reduce racial bias and anxiety, as well as to promote empathy, to enhance our support for policies that would favor and support racial equality, as well as to encourage collective action, our own and others, in supporting racial justice. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that members of ethnic, minority, and majority groups may still experience and respond to contact in very different ways, and that diverse perspectives like these must be taken into account as we seek to achieve the dual goals of improving relations between groups on the one hand and promoting racial equality and social justice on the other. So I will stop there. Thank you. Sure.
Hi, thank you very much. I have two related questions. One is you use the phrase positive contact for obvious reasons, but in your look across the research, are there some kinds of contacts that are particularly positive? So at particular ages, sharing a classroom at a certain age, rooming with someone as an undergraduate. So if you could talk about that continuum. And then second, there must be negative contacts if they're positive contacts. If you could talk about that too, please.
Great questions and stuff that I think about all the time. Generally speaking, I mean, there's kind of a few different angles or approaches that you can use from a contact theory perspective. Some people focus on structuring contact situations in the most effective way, kind of being the social engineer approach of saying, okay, we want to make sure the norms here are that everyone is equal, that they're working cooperatively toward a common goal. There's these supportive institutional norms, laws, customs where people are held accountable. All of those things will help to facilitate, if you put people in that environment, you'll see positive effects. And in our meta-analysis, what we actually find is that all things being equal, you see positive effects of contact, and that's enhanced further by the establishment of those positive conditions. Unfortunately, we know in our society, not all things are equal, and that there are negative contact experiences. In fact, I would tend to think that the more contact you have, the greater likelihood that you'll have some negative as well as positive contact. There's a whole bunch of research going on right now looking simultaneously at the effects of positive and negative contact. I've been doing some of this work as well as in collaboration with other folks. For me, I've often thought about, in the domestic, racial, and ethnic context, experiences with discrimination as a form of negative contact. We find that experiences of or perceptions of discrimination can inhibit the positive effects of contact, but not necessarily do away with them completely. I'm also right now in the middle of analyzing data from 2 random digital telephone surveys in Atlanta and Philadelphia of Black and white Americans and different immigrant groups in each of those local areas. And amazing to me is we have measures of frequency of contact, just how often do you interact with each of these other groups? We ask about the quality of the contact, how unfriendly or friendly was it, and we ask specifically about mistreatment. To what extent do you feel you've been treated poorly or mistreated by members of that group? Amazingly, if you put all three of those contact measures together, frequency is the one that's most predictive and most consistent across all groups, such that simply having more interactions with members of other groups, independent of the positive or negative valence of those interactions, is predicting greater trust, desire to get to know more, willingness to accept those others into your community and feeling welcomed by those others in your community, as well as immigration attitudes. So we're feeling encouraged by these findings, but I don't think that negative contact is trivial. I think sometimes I think we need to take them into account. So for example, in the work that I do in more post-violent settings like Northern Ireland or South Africa, we assess both positive and negative contact experiences so that we can understand how those experiences of tension and conflict might have fueled people's understandings of intergroup relationships, and to what extent can contact do anything in light of that history. And what we're finding is even after we control for factors or include in our models factors such as growing up with high levels of political or racial violence in your neighborhood, or having personally suffered, losing loved ones to the violence, above and beyond those factors and demographics, like level of education, socioeconomic status, political ideology, gender, and age, we see that contact on the positive end is predicting more positive attitudes, greater trust, and more positive beliefs about the other group's intentions in working toward peace, that they're actually genuinely interested in peace. They're not just saying it and working toward other strategic goals. Yeah.
One of the things I think I remember is that people who feel that the other group does not value diversity tend to be less interested in, okay. And so what I hear a lot on our campus is they really aren't interested in diversity. So what that is suggesting to me is some of the, what people call self-segregation on a campus like Dartmouth is probably because they are saying they aren't interested, so why do I bother with the contact?
Yeah.
So how do we, well.
I have some thoughts. One thought that comes to mind pretty quickly, and it relates to something I was talking about, at kind of that interface between racial anxiety and racial bias, is that oftentimes the nonverbal behaviors that we exhibit when we feel anxious or like we don't know how to handle the situation are the same types of nonverbals that we exhibit that others interpret as bias or prejudice. So it could be that someone, you know, at the cafeteria is like walking by a table that's mostly one group and they're of a different group, and they're like, yeah, I'm not gonna sit there because I don't feel comfortable or they won't want me there. And other people say, that person, you know, they're not giving us a chance. They're avoiding us. So there are different interpretations of the exact same behavior. And there's actually some really interesting research by Shelton and Jen Richardson, who used to be here at Dartmouth, showing that when people interpret their own behaviors, they describe it as fear of rejection. When people describe the other group's behaviors, it's they don't like us. So I wonder if that might be part of what's going on. We were also talking a bit at lunch about how events or activities are framed. I know from different universities where I've worked that oftentimes when there are events that are publicized as being diversity inclusive types of events, white students are like, oh, I'm not invited. Like they just make an assumption, probably a faulty assumption, but make an assumption that it's not for them. So I think maybe there are ways that we could reword some of those events to make clear it's actually a campus-wide activity, and we'd love for everybody to come to enhance those opportunities for exchanges and interaction.
Thank you. This is really fascinating. I'm just wondering, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the positive and the negative.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think about it. Seems like a lot of your research is about just positive interactions, you know, being on a sports team or playing Scrabble. You didn't say playing Scrabble, but I'm just wondering where does the concept of white fragility fit in? And so, for example, can you have a experience where it's perceived as positive by the white person but negative by the person of color. And I'm just wondering about in terms of authenticity of interaction. So for example, white people, this is a broad generalization, but I include myself, we may want to have a conversation, but we want to be kept safe and not uncomfortable. And I think that leads to sometimes for some people of color, they silence themselves, so they're not really authentic. Or when they say something, the white person will cry, and then the person of color has to then be put into a taking care of the white person role. So how does that all fit with white fragility? Does that make sense?
Oh, totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I have one more question, but I'll
please
ask
hold
later
it.
once it goes.
That's a fabulous, multifaceted question. So, I'm like, lots of things are firing, and I'm trying to figure out where to start. So one thing that comes to mind is that during different generations, there have been different strategies that either members of dominant groups or historically disadvantaged groups propose for how to relate to the dominant group, right? So one of the first examples that comes to mind for me is Goffman's 1963 book, Stigma, where if any of you who are in the social sciences have read it, at least I would say half of the book is basically trying to tell the stigmatized how to make quote unquote normals feel comfortable as a way to manage your stigma and integrate into society. You can imagine how you might, as a member of a stigmatized group, not feel entirely comfortable with that strategy, especially, and I would say not only wanting to silence oneself, but what I've often heard is this issue of needing to educate white people, right? It's not just that we're fragile, it's just that we're ignorant. So we, and I think for me, when I hear this issue of white fragility, I couldn't help but smiling because it's not the first time this has come up in conversation, but it relates back to those different motivations and goals that I talked about. And this isn't exactly research I've done. Nurit Schnabel in Israel has done an amazing amount of work in this area, basically showing that, when you're a member of the dominant group, your motivation is to feel like everything's okay, right? Which maintains the status quo, which serves those interests of those in the dominant group, right? If we're trying to focus on preserving our moral integrity and prove, see, I'm a good person, I'm not a bad person, I'm not one of those bad white people, right? That's the motivation that whites have in that interaction. Whereas people of color, on average, again, as Nurit's work would show, tend to be motivated by empowerment. It's like, I don't want to just make you feel good. I want you to listen to me. I want to have a voice. I want to address structural inequalities. And she sees this, and again, taking it out of the black-white context in the US, the exact same patterns between Israelis and Palestinians. The exact same patterns if you talk to different status groups in different contexts. It's just, it happens. When we're in a dominant position, we want to feel assured that we're not doing anything wrong. When we're in a subordinate position, we're like, listen to what I'm experiencing, and how could you possibly be satisfied with the status quo? Obviously, you don't care about people like me. That's where I think a lot of the breakdowns in communication occur. And what I try to remind my students, at least, is even though we can see those processes, we're still embedded within them. So at the very least, I think as a starting point, helping to remind people that we're all a function of our lived experience. What we see in the world is always a function of our lived experience. So to the extent that we can have some degree of compassion, or at least recognizing the validity of how what might appear to be clueless white people just wanting to maintain their privilege, that's something that is antithetical to their experience. It's something they actually can't relate to, haven't experienced it. And similarly, for members of dominant groups or whites who feel that people of color are, to use a modern racism term, being too demanding in their push for equal rights, it's basically, well, you don't see all the times we're patient, or you've looked over those times when we're patient and willing to talk and willing to listen, and it's hard to not get angry after a while. So I think, for me, this is also part of why I think contact is really useful, because we not only develop those kind of positive experiences playing Scrabble, but because we also start to just learn more about the subtleties in how we interact with each other and give each other more the benefit of the doubt.
Hi, I was about the contact, because you say that contact is physical contact. What role or in what way can you capture the phenomenon of like exceptionalism, in the sense that, yes, you might have white students interacting with black students, but they will be interacting with those within their own socioeconomic class. So you are a good black person because we both grew up in the suburb, you went to a private school and whatnot, but they might not feel equally accepting of, say, the public school educated black person from North Philadelphia.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just want to clarify, you used the term physical contact, and I would say face-to-face contact. I just want to make sure we're clear that I'm not endorsing physical contact between members of different groups. But that aside, so yeah, I think your question's a great one. The issue of exceptionalism is always a tough one, because if you look at more cognitive perspectives in relation to all of this research, what people would say is, on the one hand, you want to de-emphasize group difference so that when people see you, they're like, hey, we're just both people. We're both interacting. So you have lots of things in common, whether it be social class or your background or whatever it happens to be. But there are other people who say, well, that might help you guys get along at the beginning, but if you really want to change people's attitudes towards that other group as a whole, you need to make sure that that group membership is salient. You need to make sure that you're thinking of that other person as a white person or as a Latino person or as a black person. So there you want to make sure that the category is preserved. And there's a lot of people who would say that, you know, exactly as you're describing, that it's like, you know, I've had this experience too, where I happen to be Jewish, and sometimes in my international travels, I've encountered some people who are anti-Semitic who would say, you know, well, you're really nice, but you know how most Jews are, right? I mean, it's the same type of thing. And in those circumstances, I actually tried to put myself back in the prototypical center of the social category, right? Like, if you think I'm nice, well, how hard is it to entertain that all Jews might be nice? Or how is it hard to entertain that all black people might, you know, be as intelligent if they all had comparable levels of education and opportunities, right? It's a really tricky thing, and I don't know, I don't have like a single answer to address it, but I think part of it has to do with encouraging people to reflect on their conceptions of what those categories are like and how those individuals fit. Like, are we going to allow them to just place us on the fringes as exceptions to those rules, or are we going to say, actually, I'm part of this community too? And that might be an port of entry for further discussion.
So just thank you for being here, and for all of you who made it possible. So I really appreciate your approach about anxiety in these conversations. I think that's really, really crucial. And I just have one quick question, and then one, I guess, a question about resources to continue the conversation. So the first question is, you had a slide about the high implicit bias, IAT. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Dropping dramatically, and I was curious about the awareness of the participants in terms of where they were originally. Did they see, like when you do the online test, where you stand? So what was their awareness, kind of at the beginning, in the middle, at the end of all of that? And the second piece is about social media contact in all of these kind of conversations, which is a whole like 10 cans of worms. And are there any studies about that, kind of the commenting that happens and the interactions that, you know, the assumptions that are made of who's commenting and where they're coming from, and just how messy that gets, if there's any studies or research on that?
Both great questions. So the first one about the IAT, we don't actually have kind of reflective online data about how they were perceiving themselves or how their partner was perceiving them as these things unfolded. But I do know from just having worked with students and other contexts that, you know, we become aware of the biases as we fill out the IAT. It's described as an implicit associations test that has often been described to assess our unconscious biases or our unconscious prejudices, and I would argue that we become aware of them as we fill it out, especially those versions of the IAT that are online, where if you make the wrong association, there's a big red X that appears in the middle of the screen. It's a marker. It gives us some information. And we get that feeling of we're doing it wrong. right? And especially, for whites who might be fragile, that's really threatening. It's really threatening. And in fact, for those of you familiar with the stereotype threat literature, this fear of confirming a negative stereotype about your group, one of the studied stereotypes about whites is being perceived as racist, because that is a negative stereotype that whites are concerned about confirming. So I don't have direct evidence from our study, but I can see how that would fit within your question fits within a broader array of examples that I've come across. Regarding your second question about media, my first thoughts are, there's problems on many fronts in that we're encouraged to express things in soundbite form. We can hide in a very anonymous way and not be held accountable for what we say. And because of the format and the lack of direct interaction, things get polarized very quickly. So even beyond our natural proclivities to assign less positive intentions about, or assign less positive beliefs about others' intentions, people will actually say more and more outlandish things that can spiral into more heated conflict and tension over time. So, I would love to see more opportunities where people just sit down and say, you know what, let's just have a pact. Let's just be honest, to have some real conversation here. And it's not going to be comfortable, and it's not necessarily going to be easy, but it's not going to kill us either. But if we can equally commit to that, and I'm going to ask you things, and you might not understand where I'm coming from, but just know it's met with the best of intentions, and you have those real types of spaces for honest conversations like that, I think that can go a long way. I think it could actually maybe not get people to become best of friends and hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but at the very least be willing to give others the benefit of the doubt before passing judgment. And I think that's something that we're losing. I think now we just make automatic assumptions based on people's social categories, one way or the other. Yeah. Thank you.